As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. I first read an excerpt of Natalie MacLean's memoir during a scene writing class she took from me in 2020. As soon as I read her work and learned about her book's premise, I knew her story would be a hit. So it was a huge delight when I heard her interview on the Shit No One Tells You About Writing podcast late last year while driving down Interstate 81. I immediately got in touch about having her on the podcast so we could celebrate her best-selling memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. Natalie has been named World's Best Drink Journalist and has won the James Beard Foundation Journalism Award. She hosts the New York Times recommended podcast Unreserved Wine Talk and offers popular online wine and food pairing classes. To attend one of those classes, please click on the link to her website in the show notes. Before we get to our conversation, I have a few questions for you. Have you ever witnessed or been the victim of a social media pile-on? If this happened to you, how would you cope? What's your relationship to alcohol? And finally, if you're writing a book, does it have a theme? If so, have you wondered how to thread that theme through your narrative arc? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. Now, let's get to my conversation with Natalie MacLean. Hey writers, have you struggled to develop characters beyond a laundry list of physical traits, or do you fall into the tired cliches of stomachs that roil and boil, hearts that pound, and characters that look off into the distance, unsure what to do? Has a critique partner ever told you your character's motivations or actions don't make sense? Or worse, has an agent told you they just don't connect with your main character? Let's face it, developing great characters is hard work. It takes both artistry and an understanding of psychology to bring them to life and make their actions understandable. It's even harder when that character you're trying to describe is you. That's why I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to teach the psychology of character development for memoirists on June 19th, 2024. During this 90-minute webinar, you'll discover the 3-step chain of events that determines what your character does in any situation, investigate the role that core wounds, attachment styles, and inner resources play in shaping your character's personality, and find out how having your character act as if can help you limit backstory and start in the right place. Plus, you're going to learn so much more. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. You heard that right, $25. For that price, you can attend the live webinar, watch the recording, or do both, and get access to the webinar's workbook and my slides. So if you want to understand yourself better, write characters readers will fall in love with, and feel confident that you know how to do more than just craft tired cliches, go to janefriedman.com and click on paid classes, or make it easy on yourself and click on the link in the show notes. Well, hello there, Natalie. Welcome to the Writing and Resilience podcast.
It's great to be here with you, Lisa. Thank you so much. As you know, I'm a fan of your courses. So when you asked me to be here, I thought, yay, we get to talk again.
Well, and I was equally excited because I was driving down the road and I heard you on a very famous podcast. And I was like, oh, I know that voice and I know that story. So I was very excited to invite you on the show. And I have your book here. So anyone who's watching the video, Wine Witch on Fire. What a great title. So I want to begin by asking you what you would like us to know about the book and about you.
Sure. So as you said, it is Wine Witch on Fire, and the subtitle is brought to you by all the dismal Ds, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. It is the story of how one woman resurrects her life and career in the glamorous but sexist wine industry. So it starts with a shock. My husband of 20 years, high-powered CEO, asks for a divorce. I felt blindsided. And then my year gets even worse when an online mob comes for my career. And so I am wavering between despair and determination. I have to fight for my son, my reputation, my self-worth. And along the way, I really do question my role in the slick marketing that does encourage women to
Mhm.
drink too much.
Yeah.
And I have to reconnect with the vineyards that once brought me joy, the friends who sustain me, my own belief in second chances. So that's why I call Wine Witch on Fire a true coming of middle age story about transforming your life and finding love along the way.
Yeah, I love how you frame things. And I think the way you frame things is definitely a part of your voice. I mean, I think it's the voice we see online, it's the voice we see in this book. I imagine it's also the voice we see in your other books, which are specifically about wine. And so I want to begin there, though I have given you other questions that we will also get to. How did you develop this really strong, specific, and engaging voice?
Well, thank you, Lisa. That means a lot coming from you. I grew up, my mother was a single parent, a school teacher, and we moved around about 14 times before I turned 10. We were always going to new small towns on the East Coast. And so that sort of starting over again and again made me an outsider, as did my natural shyness and introversion. So I was always listening. I didn't talk a lot. And I think I developed an ear for dialogue because I was
Mm.
always really hyper paying attention to what people said, what they did, why. I was always trying to figure these things out in my mind. And I remember when I was in grade 6, we had a project. I forget if they gave us the topic or whatever, but I was talking about, I don't know, an old man who was grumpy about a puppy who walked over his clean floor. And I said something like, "You little whippersnapper, get over here." And anyway, the teacher at the time liked that because I was using real life language and dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the voice comes from just being a really close, attentive listener and then writing the way I talk and the way that I hear others talk.
I love that. And, we often think that we have to learn to be a better writer by writing, which of course is a piece of it, and reading, but listening can play such an important role in the work that we do. And I want to get a little bit deeper into this book because, girl, you got 2012. And so I'm going to just let people know what I mean by that in case somebody is like, what in the world are you talking about, Lisa? Okay, so when I say somebody got 2012, I mean that they experienced the 2012 version of existential crisis that blew up their life and allowed them to reclaim who they are. And in my case, I experienced Lyme disease. That's when I got it. And then I just revolutionized my life. In your case, you experienced what to me has been my greatest fear, the online pileup.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. So, and for years, Lisa, I thought, oh my gosh, I just said, walk away from this dumpster fire, forget about
Mm-hmm.
it. It was too painful to even look at my notes. I locked them away. Like for 5 years, I did that. And I thought, if I write about this, I'm just going to be vandalizing my own privacy.
Mm.
Public forum, I'm going to start it all up again. The trolls will come back. But the story just kept ricocheting around in my head for so long that finally I felt I have to get this out on paper, even if it's
Mm-hmm.
just a private exercise in making sense of what happened, because we're writers, right? That's how we
Mm-hmm.
make sense of things. Yeah. But then over the years, I mean, this was a decade ago that this happened, as you say, 2012. I love that expression. I'm going to use that one if you don't mind. I heard similar stories from other women, not just in the wine industry, but also in tech and sport and finance and the military. I mean, it was all over. And the situational specifics were different, but the themes and the
Mm-hmm.
feelings, the need for recovery were very much the same. And so I think what I hope a good memoir does is that it takes people on a journey. And even though, again, the situation may be different, they're resonating with it. So someone reading my book may not have gone through divorce or a bad breakup, but they probably felt loneliness or a longing for love. They may not have been online mobbed, hopefully, but they've probably felt fear of the future or some career disappointment or
Mm.
uncertainty of some sort of thing. And when someone can capture those feelings into words,
Yes.
I think that can be healing. And to know how someone else emerged from life's dumpster fires, because it's going to get you one way or the other, how you
Mm-hmm.
emerge from those fires, singed but not shattered. But one more note I'll add, I definitely needed the years the distance, the
Mm-hmm.
telescopic lens that could pull back and look at what happened so that this memoir wasn't just a misery dump and like,
Yes.
oh, poor little me. And, I was inspired finally to publish it when, I read memoirs, Glennon Doyle, who said, write from a scar, not an open wound.
Mm-hmm.
And then my family asked, well, why are you writing about this? All the healing's done. Good for you, Nat. But why write about this? And I love poet Sean Doherty, who said, why bother? Because
Mm-hmm.
there's someone out there right now who has a wound in the exact shape of your words.
So beautifully said. And I love that you shared that. So you took the time, which is, I think, really important for people to hear, that we have to have distance in order
Mhm.
to write these stories because that gives us perspective. You
Yes.
thought about how you could do this in a way that doesn't vandalize your experience. Or I think what Roxane Gay talks about is cannibalizing yourself, right? So, using your experience, sharing it in so many different ways that it takes away from you. And yet, even when you have done all of that work, which you clearly have, you start writing. When you're writing about the toughest stuff, it is like you are reliving it. And that is something you also talk about in this book. So, how did you take care of yourself when, even though you were trying to have that telescopic lens that took you back, the pages and the writing was bringing you right into it?
Yes. And even just when I sometimes still talk about what happened, I slip into the present tense as though it is
Mm-hmm.
happening. And,
Yeah.
I mentioned this in the book, but they've done MRI studies, brain scans of people being read a script of a car accident that they didn't die, but they almost did. And the
Mm-hmm.
same areas of the brain light up. We're not remembering these things, we're reliving them.
Yes.
And so, I mean, first of all, lots of therapy that continues to this day. That's one way in which I was taking care of myself. Of course, again, I had the distance to realize I didn't get sued, I didn't fall apart, I still have my career, and so on, which I couldn't realize at the time. So there is a safety of writing
Mm-hmm.
about it with that separation of time that really,
Yes.
really helps. And then for the reader, what helps is that you're able to share those reflections and learnings. As
Mm-hmm.
Marion Roach, someone says, it's not what happened to you, it's what you did with it. And that's what people are
Yes.
looking for, right? But the challenge for me still was, as I was writing about this and kind of reliving it, was making it through the arsenic hour of 5
Mm-hmm.
p.m. when there's a natural dip of serotonin and you want to take arsenic or administer it to those around you because you're tired, you're angry, you're frustrated or whatever. And that was the time when I want to reach for a glass of wine to
Mm-hmm.
kind of drown those feelings out. And so to take care of myself, Lisa, I really had to convince myself that chemical relaxation was not Natalie relaxation, and
Yes.
to think about future Nat, tomorrow morning Nat. Just writing, we live in our heads. But I had been a dancer for years. What I had to do was try to get back down into my body, literally, and stop living in that icy attic of my mind. And so what I would do is a 5-second circuit breaker. I put my hand on my heart, literally,
Mm-hmm.
say, take a deep breath. And what is it you need now?
Yes.
What was the thought just before the thought that said, I need a drink? And was it
Mm-hmm.
about frustration or whatever? And could I take care of it in another way? Just go for a walk, have a bath, watch a show, anything to have that 5-second circuit breaker. And that really helped.
I love that. And it actually pairs nicely with something that Nicole LaPera has in her book, How to Become the Love You Seek, which is a book that just recently came out. She does a lot of work on Instagram. And so I'll also link to that in case anyone wants to see it. But yeah, she talks about that exercise where you do that circuit breaking, where you pause and say, what is it that I need? What was happening directly before? Because I think when you understand the antecedent, and so that's just fancy talk for the thing that happened before, you
Yeah,
can begin to say, what is it that I really need? And how can I cope in a different way? So,
right.
I want to get to some of the things you talked about in terms of there's the caretaking you did for yourself, and we're going to talk about how drinking has changed for you. So I think we're going to go there next. But what I
Mhm.
want to get to is the vessel for your book. I just wrote that down in case anyone heard my little scribbly pen, because I think one of the ways that you may have cared for yourself. I'm curious about that. And also cared for the reader is in the structuring of the book. But before we get to that, let's talk about drinking because that is in the title, right? Rising from the ashes of divorce, defamation, and drinking too much. And so, how has your relationship with alcohol changed, especially since alcohol is your job?
Exactly. As I used to say, I drink for a living. But now I tell my online course students, actually, the difference between tasting and drinking is spitting and thinking. So
Mm,
we actually spit the samples we're tasting. But, in terms of how it's changed, I mean, I wrote about wine for 14 years before I got 2012, as you said. And I could always separate, may sound weird, but I could separate personal and professional wine. But because of everything that was happening, the divorce, the mobbing, and the easy access. I mean, I lived in an enophile's paradise. Wine was coming to the door every day, samples from wineries, agencies, and so on. And I had the cloak of professional respectability. If you
mm-hmm.
saw a glass of wine in my hand at lunch, no one questioned that. Oh, she's
Right.
working. But she's also swallowing and doing too much of it. So I really had to reevaluate that relationship. So first back to therapy. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
these therapy sessions are in the book. So, I didn't mean for this to be a self-help book, but the response from readers seems to indicate that they really love the tips and the things that my therapist and I explored, as a wine professional trying to cut down our consumption,
Right.
because a lot of people are on that journey. So first and foremost, I had to deal with the underlying issues: depression from the divorce, anxiety from the mobbing. And then
Mm-hmm.
it was like 50% of that need or more dropped away for that glass of wine. Dealing with the underlying issues, that was first. And then we had to develop a lot of tactical strategies. Like, if I opened a full bottle of wine for personal consumption, I pour half of it into a half empty bottle, save that for another day. It made me more mindful of how much I was consuming. It kept it fresh for another day. So I didn't get into this mentality of eat all the peas off your plate, may as well drink it because it's open sort of thing. So there's a whole lots of those kinds of tips. But, my relationship to alcohol too just required a lot of thought. And it's like,
Yeah.
why did I get into this business of wine?
Mm-hmm.
I was first drawn to the sensory pleasures of it, and I had to get back to that. So to move away from the anesthetic, if you will, and back to the aesthetic, the
Mm-hmm.
joy, not the buzz. And buzz is a bonus, but it's not what I'm trying to aim for now. It's to appreciate that wine slowly and mindfully.
I love that answer. And I'm going to just take this a little deeper. And what I always tell people is speak from an I statement because, we can't speak for anyone else but ourselves. But, I think one thing that people really struggle with is what is the difference between problem drinking and addiction? Right. And so some of the characteristics of addiction, which I will add something in the show notes so people can see this, are when we're struggling with addiction, we might have tolerance. It takes more in order to have the same effect. We have cravings. We want it. We think about it maybe when we shouldn't be thinking about it, or it seems weird that we're thinking about it. And then we have problems in various aspects of our lives, usually two or more places. And that is part of it. And we can't stop, right? So those are some of the characteristics of addiction. The way you write about this does not suggest addiction, but I'm curious, given your family history, which is something that you share in the book, how did you think about this and say, I know that this is perhaps drinking that is not serving me versus addiction? And how did that affect the way you changed your relationship to wine?
Well, I asked my therapist point blank, first of all, should I quit? Should I go sober? Because alcoholism, or as we call it now, I believe, alcohol use disorder,
Mm-hmm.
runs in my family, both sides of my family. And so my Celtic relatives always sort of smile and say, the moth likes to fly close to the flame because I'm writing about alcohol. But she said, in her experience, she felt that quitting doesn't always work. In my situation, it would be punitive. I'd have to give up my career. And she
Mm-hmm.
said, let's focus on strategies first to get you from over drinking to moderation. Now,
Mm-hmm.
for some people, that's not the answer, and quitting is
Right.
the answer. I should add, definitely, like it's not for everybody. But In terms of trying to evaluate, was I sliding into addiction? I think it is on a spectrum. I'm not an expert, a health expert, nor am I a doctor, and I say that in the book. And so my advice is just, as you say, from the personal perspective. But there were nights when I was clearly blacking out, not remembering sections of the
Mhm.
night, being embarrassed in the morning, waking up and asking my partner, did I say anything stupid? Did I do anything
Mm.
stupid? And that's so like not only that loss of control and that fear and anxiety of, I actually don't remember everything. So those are all part of the package too for full on addiction. But I had to kind of say, okay, who who am I and who do I want to be?
Mhm.
And how does wine fit into that? So once we sort of confronted those sort of rather blunt questions in therapy and started working on harm reduction and got to a place where I was comfortable and where my therapist thought I had made a lot of progress, to that place, that's where I remained. I love wine. I want to continue working in it. I love it personally, that sort of thing. But I gotta say, like, and you were very astute, Lisa. I think you picked up on perhaps this whole resolution of, are you just a problem drinker or an addict, like especially in the past, that behavior.
Mhm.
You picked up on that. It is the least resolved thing in the book because I am still very much a work in progress. I am still in therapy. I would love to tie a red bow on this and say, all done, but it's just not the case. And so the struggle has become a lot less, on a daily basis because you do form habits, you do break
Mhm.
certain habits and the emotional pull of them and the grip they have on you. But every day I have to make a conscious decision of who I want to be and how is wine a part of that.
That's such a great answer. And I also want to say you are in great company because I am also in therapy. I've been in
Mm,
therapy for many, many years, and I will probably be in therapy for many, many more years because for many of us, I think growth, there is no end point in our
right.
growth process, and having support is a great thing. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you are in therapy, I think a lot of people need to hear this. It is not a deficit, right? It
Mhm.
is a privilege because not everyone has access to therapy. And I worked at a mental health counseling center that specifically offered therapy to people who wouldn't otherwise have it. But I think that allowing yourself to have support is so important because good health and good mental health is a moving target because life is constantly happening around us and we have to figure out how are we going to handle these stressors, how are we going to navigate these new situations, and just like any other thing that we've had a habit around, right? Whether it is sitting on the couch or drinking too much alcohol or eating too much cake, it is
Mhm.
very easy to slip back into old behaviors, especially when stresses happen in our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's a constant, but it's also part of the thrill of being human, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't just get to like, check off certain, oh, yeah, done, whatever. It's the struggle is also what counts. I mean, it also gives us lots more to write about. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, so it's gonna be a good thing too.
I think it definitely is. And when we think about that version of heaven where it's like you never are hungry and there's always everything you need, and that can sound really good. It also sounds really boring.
It
I have to
does.
admit, it does. So, yeah, the struggle is where the juice lies. And if you are a writer, it is also where you gather your material.
Hmm.
And you have gathered a lot of material for this book. So, in this book, you talk about Brene Brown, and she has this great quote from Theodore Roosevelt about being in the arena. And you are definitely in the arena in this book. And yet, you talked before about how you cared for yourself and how, therapy and distance, and you had all these things that helped you have a container around the work that you did. But I feel like there's a vessel for this book, right? There is the story, and then there are these other things that you wrap into the book that also care for the reader and create some delight. So, for instance, for me, you taught me a lot about wine. And I'm going to be honest with you. Before, like, I can't drink alcohol now just because I'd had Lyme disease and that's something I can't do. But I loved wine before. And yet, I was pretty wine ignorant. So I was the person who was like, that is an interesting label. I think I will buy that. And yet you taught me so many things about wine that were really interesting. And you took me deep into the history of, winemaking, and also the deep misogyny that exists within this field, and how that plays out in some really powerful and ugly ways when that online pylon happens. So, what told you in the book writing process that you needed to gather up these other elements and infuse them into the book?
Well, I think they add a layer of richness and detail that I hope makes the book more interesting. Because again, my story, I mean, there might be a small audience who want to know exactly what happened to me, and that's it. It's probably my mother, my cousins, and so on. But more people want to know beyond the reflections and what did you do? How did you recover? Maybe a behind the scenes or an insider peek into an industry that they have certain perceptions of, but
Mm-hmm.
no idea what really goes on. And the wine industry, I think, is one of those. It's sort of glamorous. You think of leafy vineyards and sun-dappled verandas, and everybody's just drinking wine and eating bonbons all day. And it does have a gritty reality that at the same time shares so many parallels with other industries where there is
Yes.
rampant sexism. You mentioning tech, sport, military, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very hierarchical industry because it's based on, hundreds, sometimes thousands of years of tradition, from the rules of winemaking to the scores. We don't give ratings to lettuce and orange juice, but we sure do
Right.
to wine. Everything is scored, and there's medals, and there's, the top echelon, in the industry is still pretty much stale pale male, and the worker bees are women. And so all of that, it's sort of a country club power mentality that fosters a lot of control and silence.
Yeah.
And you do not go against the grain. And pun intended or not, it has a very fast social grapevine. You can
Mm-hmm.
easily be delisted out of a career. And so that's another reason I wrote the book and included all of this, because there are a lot of young women trying to make their way in the wine
Mm-hmm.
industry, but also in other industries that share so many parallels, that cannot afford to tell the story I told. And I'm hearing from them behind the scenes, of course. So I told my partner, well, you can't kill me twice. At least I think you can't. I have so much less to lose now, having been writing about wine for 25 years almost, that I feel in a safe place to tell the story. But that is why I wove in so much about the wine industry, both for those outside of it who are curious and those who are inside of it who feel that they can't talk about these things.
Yeah, and I think there were two ways that this showed up that really were, I'm going to say, heart punches for me. That's probably the best way to talk about it. One, the descriptions of the wines, and talking about the flavors. So much sexism in the
Mm.
way that some of these descriptions play out. I was like, OMG, I see it all over the place. And then some of the awful things people said specifically about you, which you share in the book, really show the way that the misogyny shows up within this industry. And it made me think about all of these different ways that these things show up in other industries as well. So you definitely opened my eyes to that. And you had this other interesting thread that shows up throughout, which was a fun thread. So, you have about the misogyny, you have all of this information about the wine, which also is fun, but then you have this witch thread, right? This theme of the witch, which, if you think about this, a mob coming after you with the pitchforks, which is virtually what happened. What told you that this theme or this thread would work in the book? And when
Mm.
did you figure out that this was the one?
Yeah, I always say, well, when you hear the title Wine Witch on Fire, you think this is about an angry woman who drinks a lot of wine and owns a lot of cats, and just it's all bitter. But it's not. There is humor. But the witch theme, really resonated with me. It has resonated with me since I was a child. I mean, my
Mm.
favorite childhood stories were always about witches: Wizard of Oz, the good, the bad. I even love that badass white witch of Narnia and the way
Yes.
she froze out Christmas. So for
Mm-hmm.
little goody Miss Two Shoes, that was very, very satisfying. And so, as I was drafting the manuscript, I had alluded to witches a couple of times, but as I sort of went back and forth with my editor, she said, lean into it or don't use
Mm-hmm.
it. Otherwise, it might come off either as superficial and unsatisfying or as disrespectful to the women who were persecuted and
Mm-hmm.
killed in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I think leaning into this metaphor became a more fruitful way of finding ways to look back on the situation, because I decided to go all in, and of showing, not telling. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, when the online mobbing was happening, if I just, responded to any of the commenters, I got flaming responses. If I didn't post, they accused me from running away from the issue. So,
Mm-hmm.
that reminded me, if back in colonial Salem, the one of the ways to tell if a woman was a witch is to strip her down to her undergarments, bind her and throw her in a lake. If she was innocent, she would sink to the bottom and drown.
Mm-hmm.
But if she floated, then she was a witch and she was dragged to the stake and burned. So it's like social media, damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
Yes.
It captured it for me without wanting to equate exactly what was happening with what was happening to them. So it allowed me to share more satisfying, I think, reflections as well as vulnerability and
Mm-hmm.
surprise. But, just to wrap this up, I do realize how damaging stereotypes of women can be. I do think it's time to reclaim that word witch.
Yes.
And for me, what a witch is a wise woman who has been through the fire of life
Mm-hmm.
and has come out the other end stronger, fiercer, wiser.
And I think that definitely shows up in the book. And what I liked about this, in addition to that example you had around how do you tell if someone's a witch? Oh, they will die either way, right?
Yes.
Is that not a lot has changed in some
Mm,
ways. That was one of the powerful takeaways I had, is that yes, things have changed in certain ways. And yes, women have more rights than, say, the 18th, 19th century and even the 1970s. And yet, perceptions of women have not necessarily changed. What happens regarding how you respond, and I think one thing I was picking up on is a concern is like, oh, if witch is in the title, then people are going to think this is angry and bitter, because we are not allowed to be angry or bitter, which we can. I'm just going to say that out loud. But this book certainly isn't angry and bitter. There is lots of humor, there is a lot of vulnerability, and there's a lot of just great storytelling in the way that you told this. And yet, that is something that you confront in this book. It's like, okay, there's this whole legacy around how the witch, that is being chased out of town or, towards the water, is treated. And this is something that I'm confronting, because what I noticed in this book towards the end is that there were a lot of ways that your livelihood was deeply affected. And I think there were presentations that you had, there were columns that you had that you lost. And it took, I think, 5 years
mm-hmm.
to get some of that back.
It
Even
did.
though when people read this, they're going to be like, oh, this mistake is not that big.
Mhm.
I mean, that was my perception of it. Like, and I was like, man, we could all, any of us could do this. I mean, I just was, and I'm not going to give it away because I want people to read your book, but the reaction, I think, really does speak to how women are treated. And I think you do a great job of sharing that. And so the writing of the book is wonderful. And I mean, your titling, which you are just a master titler. So I'm going to just say the titles of your other books, because so many people struggle with that. And yet, I don't know if you struggled or not, but it doesn't look like you do. So we have Red, White, and Drunk All Over. And then there's also your podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk. And so we have these great titles. And you are also a great marketer of your book, right? So you have
Thank you.
this wonderful podcast that you host, and you have this great addendum document, right? It's this additional thing that you have created. And so many people who are going to be listening to this podcast are writers, and some of them are just writing for themselves, trying to figure out how do I make sense of this experience. Your book will definitely help them do that. But also, people want to get their work published, and they're thinking, how do I get my work out in a unique way? And so I have a two-part question, right? So one is I want to talk about this document that you have created that goes along with your book, this companion guide. How has that helped you market your book? How has that enhanced that?
Sure. So the companion document that you're referring to is a reader guide
Yeah.
or book club guide. And what happened is that the book was, two things were happening with the book as I wrote it. First of all, it was getting a little long. But second of all, so what's in this reader guide? It goes chapter by chapter and gives you wines to enjoy as you're reading the book and discussion questions for your book club, or for, just spouses will often read this book together and
Mm-hmm.
dig into the layers more deeply, because it's not just what did you feel about, what happened here. It's how do you feel about your own relationship with alcohol? What do you
Mm-hmm.
think about the way wine is marketed to men versus women? Deeper issues. So, but all of this was like these wine things and questions were at the end of each chapter, but there was kind of a tonal problem that was happening,
Mm-hmm.
in that, if you're in trouble or you're down, here's a wine. I recommend an Amarone with a bitter finish. Like, it was trivializing the actual sentiment and what was happening. If you're happy, here's a joyful wine. And so I'm not advocating dealing with emotions or life situations with wine. So we
Mm-hmm.
separated it out for length and for tonality, and it is a substantial document. I think it's about 10,000 words, and it's free, but it's also a great marketing vehicle, as you said. So in the book, I mention it, but I also was promoting it on social media through my email list and all
Mm-hmm.
other channels. I included the reader guide, a mention of it in the book, and I also promoted it on social media, email, all my channels, so that those who may not have read the book can download it for free
Mm-hmm.
at nataliemaclean.com/guide, or just winewitchonfire.com. I also got the book title, which I recommend to writers. Get your book title, especially if your name's easy to misspell. People will remember the title, winewitchonfire.com, more than they'll
Yes.
remember the spelling of your name. Anyway, so they can download the guide there. And I'm hoping that it gets them more involved and curious about the book, because there's also tips on organizing your own informal wine tasting, whether that's with friends or your book club and so on. So that's really helped as a marketing vehicle. The
Mm-hmm.
other thing I did, Lisa, was put bonuses on my website. So if you buy the book at any point, you can get a free online tasting with me. I give away all kinds of things, the lost chapters, which is just another fancy way of saying what ended up on the cutting room floor, and various things. So if listeners and writers want to go and either get the bonuses or just look at how I structured the
Mm-hmm.
bonuses for buying the book, it really helped with pre-orders, which are so important,
Yes.
but it helps ongoing book sales. They continue to, trot along at a really good pace.
Yeah, and I'm going to invite people to sign up for your newsletter so they can get this. And that's one thing that I also want to point out is very clever and also great marketing, right? Because writers have to be marketers too, whether we
We
like it
do.
or not, is that, your email list is one of the most important things that you can build. And that is something that happens automatically if you sign up for this. And this document is really clever. It's really well done. The graphics are nice. It's very clean. It's engaging. It's got a strong sense of voice. So there's a lot of things that you can see that Natalie has done to help people deepen their engagement with their book, right? Because one of the things we want is not just for people to buy the book, but for people to enjoy the book and to
Yes,
talk about the book later with their friends. And this gives
exactly.
you a lot of ways to do that. So I highly recommend writers do that, even if you're not interested in wine, for the very purpose of seeing a strong marketing document, because it will help you with your book launch. I really love that document. I thought that was really nicely done.
Oh,
And
thank you,
so,
Lisa. And I just want to add one thing, that my two favorite reviews, I can't quote them verbatim, but they came from teetotalers for this book, people who don't drink wine at all, which meant so much to me. So, you're saying even if you don't enjoy wine, like, there are a number of people reading this who, don't drink at all. But anyway.
And I happen to be one of them at this point in my life. I can't.
Yes.
But,
Yes.
and yet I still like that. And I appreciated, I think it was Chardonnay you had in there, and you were talking about how it cuts through the butter, right? And the
Mm,
fat. Did I get
yes.
the wine right?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, that's why they're paired together. It's not all
Mm,
about the label. Like, you taught me something that was really helpful. And so I think if you're having a dinner party, even if you are a person who doesn't drink, or maybe you want to get a non alcoholic wine, you could think about these things and how it enhances the taste and how it's about the experience. And so you have this great marketing document. In addition to, of course, you have a strong voice, you have this podcast that you also host. And then, of course, there is social media. And social media happened to be the place where the big bad thing happened in your life.
mhm.
What is your relationship like with social media now, and how has that been influenced by your past experience and just anything that you're reading or learning about?
Yes. Well, at the time this was happening, friends and family would say, well, just turn it off, turn the internet
Mm-hmm.
off, don't look. And I thought, well, I make my living online. I can no more walk away from this than a surgeon can operate outside a hospital. I mean, I can't. So, day after day, I drank that venom. The difference today, though, is that I tell myself block and walk. So if there are any
Mm-hmm.
jerks, I just block them and goodbye. Stop trying to monitor what your naysayers are saying, because you'll always have detractors. If you're saying
Yes.
anything of worth, it's going to always have detractors. Hopefully
Mm-hmm.
they're in the minority, but it's a reality. And a people pleaser, as many of us tend to be, will never, ever please all the people all the time. Just as a book, if you're trying to appeal to everybody, you're going to appeal to no one, as they say. So with social media, I'm a lot more confident now. I don't fearfully step among the tweets and so on, but I do a lot of, not a lot, there actually aren't a lot of jerks, or maybe I've just blocked them all now out there. So, but I also keep my personal life off. I always did. I
Mm-hmm.
always did social media just professionally. I'm lucky that my profession is very lifestyle, very seemingly personal, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not. I don't talk about my family on social media. I don't reveal personal things generally, only as they relate to wine. So that's kind of my relationship now with social media.
Yeah, I love that. You have really good boundaries. You're really clear about your persona. What is your online persona? And I think, some people will think like, oh, if you have an online persona, well, then that's fake, right? That's like the fake version of you. And it's not the fake version of you. It is the version of you that is for public consumption. And it is perfectly fine to have a version of yourself that is for private consumption only, like talking about your family. I was reading an article this morning about Instagram and parents who had created these Instagram accounts for their children so that
Mhm.
their children could become influencers, and it goes down this very dark path. And if I can find the article, I will add it in case anyone wants to read it. But the point is that there was no separation between, personal and private, and that is one of the things that created a lot of the darkness in terms of how some of the stuff can play out. And it's important for us to have boundaries, and I will tell people, if I won't shout it to my friend in Walmart, it doesn't
Mhm.
belong online. For me, that is my value. It's, of
Yep.
course, everyone can create their own values, but I love that you have that, and that you have a certain kind of relationship. You know what social media is for you, and you figured out these other inventive and clever ways to market your work so that you can get your books in the hands of readers. And then, I think Jane Friedman had this on the Hot Sheet, which is a paid newsletter that she has that I read, that to this day, the main way that books are sold is by word of mouth.
Yes, absolutely.
And yeah, your your book guide helps people do that. They
Yeah.
can engage in a way that creates those word of mouth recommendations.
And I can see sometimes how it spreads, like the emails and direct messages
Mm-hmm.
I get back is there's always a thread. So and so told me about your book, especially, I'm post launch now, but I love seeing that kind of like a genealogy or a trace back to, and you can see how it spreads, especially if people
Mm-hmm.
are enjoying your book, but it is organic, unless you're whatever, John Grisham, none of us is going to get an advertising campaign or whatever. You've got to go one person at a time. No silver bullet that I've discovered, just one person at a time to tell them about your book.
Absolutely. That's another thing that you have a podcast, and that gives you this really nice platform where you can talk about things, build an audience, talk about wine, which is, plays a big role in this book, but then you are also on other podcasts like this one, which
Yes,
also help spread the word and help people get to know you in a certain way. And I think those those relationships that you build and those connections you make are so meaningful.
they are, because I think people, we all have such busy lives. They want more than just a good book. And, I hope my book is a good one, but they want to know more about the person. It's kind of why,
Yes.
People magazine and all the rest of them have such, continue to sustain large circulations, even with the decline of print. As people, we're so curious about other people. So beyond the book, who is this and why should I invest, a number of hours reading this book? So it's that connection as well.
Absolutely. So I'm going to end with three lightning round questions. And the first one is, what is the best piece of writing advice that you have been given?
I think it's a myth, but Hemingway said, write drunk, edit sober. But my advice would be write and edit sober. I think a lot of people are under the mistaken, misconception that, the drinking loosens all your inhibitions and gets you to say things you wouldn't say normally. Well, it might in a dinner party, but on the page, I think you need all your faculties and to
Mm-hmm.
focus. And then, but how do you get rid of your inhibitions without
Yeah.
drink or something else? To me, it's like driving. Don't drive with your foot on the brake. So don't try to
Mm-hmm.
edit at the same time as you're writing. It just won't work. And so I really had to put it all of it on the page. The shameful bits, the stuff that I thought,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that paragraph's not very good. Keep going, keep going, keep going. I think was it Annie Lamont, somebody says the vomit draft or whatever, but
Yes.
just get it all out, because I think for many of us, certainly for me, it is far easier to edit than to write in the first place. So let it all out.
Absolutely. And I think Natalie Goldberg in Writing Down the Bones has this great way of putting it. She says, just sit down and write and do not cross anything out. And in
Yes.
that case, sometimes writing in a notebook can be better because I don't know about
Mm.
you, but at least for me, when I'm typing on the page and I can type much faster than I can write in my notebook, the little squiggly line that's like, oh, look, this word's misspelled, or oh, you missed a comma, it puts the editor in place in my mind, and then
Mhm.
and then I want to go back and cross out and make things sound better. Whereas if I'm writing in my notebook, I can write with abandon, right? I think
Mm.
that's the point of that Hemingway quote, is
Yes.
to write with abandon and to write without feeling the need to edit yourself. And so those are some of the strategies I use. Are there any specific strategies you use when you're actually sitting down to write that help you do that?
The only thing I try to do is also compartmentalize. So to try to, okay, let's just focus on this thing, this scene. So
Yes.
write it like a movie script. Let's just deal with this scene, then this scene. It doesn't matter if they're in order or not. You can move them around easily
Mm-hmm.
on Word or Scrivener or whatever you use. But just get the scenes down, because often, like even an article for a magazine, it comes to me first from one little piece of dialogue or something. I always say, if I were
Mm-hmm.
a painter, I'd start with one seagull in the corner and then paint out
Yes.
from there. But it's whatever is captured your imagination. Just go with that little tiny nugget and then build a scene around it, and then build another
Mm-hmm.
scene, then and they will fit together. And then some of them you'll axe out later, but just try it like that. And then it doesn't seem so overwhelming.
I love that. That's beautiful. And it reminds me of what Anne Lamott says in her book, Bird by Bird, the 2 inch picture frame, right? Write the scene that fits in the 2 inch picture frame. And when you do that, you narrow in on one specific moment. And that's how you get that really cinematic writing. So
Exactly. Love that.
beautifully done. What is one thing you do to nurture your resilience?
Get a good night's sleep and
Yes.
and not overdrink. May be obvious, but in terms of my own consumption, I share this openly. If we're talking about my personal consumption, I only consume alcohol, wine only, 3 nights a week, 4 nights, no alcohol. And on those nights, they're usually, when I'm out to dinner with my partner or we're making dinner as a family and it's a communal. thing. And I strive to have 1 to 2 glasses. Sometimes I'll dip to 3. It's still within the bounds of moderation, but
Hmm.
for me, it makes me feel good. I get up the next day feeling good, and it keeps my health on a level where I want it.
I love that. And I love the specificity of it.
Yeah.
It helps us to wrap our minds around, like, well, what does this look like for Natalie? And then how could I think about what it might look like, for me if I'm the listener? Final thing, you have this beautiful book. I'm going to show it again for people who might be seeing the video. How can people find you online, and where would you like them to buy your book?
Anywhere books are sold. Thank you, Lisa. It's available through all online retailers all around the world. So all your biggies. And you can always go to winewitchonfire.com if you want the bonuses. Even if you've already bought the book, you can still get the bonuses. There's bonuses if you buy, I think it's like 3 or 4 copies or more, like for your book club, there's more. You can find me on social media, but I'd rather you come to my website, get the guide, get the bonuses, that sort of thing. And then we can connect from there on various channels. My podcast, of course, because this is a podcast, so you have listeners. So Unreserved Wine
Yes.
Talk, please join me. It's a lot of fun. I interview lots of people in the wine world, storytellers, mostly writers.
And that's what I noticed about how you approach your work with wine is it's through storytelling, right?
Yes.
Even when you're talking about different aspects of the wine industry, it's always story driven. You're not just handing me the facts. And I think that's one of the things that made me fall in love with your work
Oh,
and why I
thank
was so
you.
excited to have you on the podcast. So thank you so much for being here today. It has definitely been an honor and a pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Lisa. It's so good to reconnect with you. I was going to say I raise my glass to you. It's just got tea right now, but tonight I will raise a proper glass of wine to you and your podcast and to your health. I love this conversation. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. And here is my glass of tea right back
All
at
right.
you.
Virtual clink.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.